In this video tutorial, I'd like to show you how to set up an electronic drum set. In this case, the Millenium MPS-850. The process can vary slightly depending on the manufacturer and model, but the basic steps like setting up the rack, positioning the pads and connecting the module are always similar. One exception to this rule are electronic drums designed like acoustic kits with real wooden shells. Just like an acoustic set, an electronic drum kit should always be placed on a rug. That stops the components from moving around and helps to protect the floor. Let's take a look inside the package and see what we've got. The big box contains many small boxes. In the case of the MPS-850, we've got a drum rack, the kick pad with a pedal, 3 10-inch drum pads, 2 8-inch drum pads, the cymbal pads and the ride in a separate box, a hi-hat stand with accessories, the module, and a box of accessories. I'll start with the accessory box, because it contains the assembly instructions and a square key, which we're going to need for the next steps. Now we're ready to set up the drum rack. So let's start by laying out all the parts. Like most drum racks, the rack of the MPS-850 consists of a center section and side extensions. In this case, we've also got a boom for the snare drum pad. Some other models come with standard snare stands instead. To begin, it's a good idea to connect the various parts on the ground first. Refer to the instructions for your specific kit to find out which brackets to use to connect the sections. At this point, it's a good idea to make sure that all the legs are roughly the same length. The screws on the vertical sections should only be hand tightened at this point, because we'll need to make some adjustments later. The horizontal sections can already be fastened all the way. We've almost finished the first step. Let's bring the rack into an upright position, position the extensions at an angle, check for stability, and tighten all remaining screws. To finish up, we still need to attach the extension for the snare drum. It should remain flexible at this point, because we'll need to move it later. Now we've completed the basic setup of the rack. Next, let's attach the mounts for the toms and the snare drum. I'll start with the mount for Tom 1, and I'll make sure that it's positioned at a right angle to the rack. The same applies to the mounts for Tom 2, Tom 3, and Tom 4. According to the instructions for the Millenium MPS-850, the holder for the snare drum pad should be attached to the bottom of the tube, so I'll do that for now. As we'll position the snare at a slight angle later, we don't need to pay attention to a right angle in this case. Next, let's attach the booms for crash 1, the ride cymbal pad, and crash 2. And then we're ready to mount the first pads to the rack. At this early stage, we only need to position the drum pads roughly. We'll take care of the details later. But it's a good idea to make sure that the pads are positioned somewhat correctly from the start. Various manufacturers have come up with different ways to stop the cymbal pads from rotating. On the MPS-850, there's a little plastic piece here that slides into a groove in the pad. That's especially useful if the playing area only takes up part of the pad. Just like the drum pads, we can now bring the cymbal pads roughly into their intended positions. This applies to the ride cymbal pad and the 2 crash pads. For the hi-hat, the MPS-850 uses a standard stand, which is assembled just like any other hi-hat stand. After attaching the pedal and spreading out the legs, we can assemble the thin hi-hat rod and then connect the upper tube to the bottom section of the stand. Before mounting the pad, we need to attach the clutch, which is fastened using 2 lock nuts. While some electronic drum sets use a simple pedal as a hi-hat controller, the MPS-850 has a mechanical sensor that measures how far the hi-hats are opened. It slides over the top of the stand and sits underneath the pad. This particular kit has a freestanding bass drum pad. Other electronic drum sets come with bass drum pads that are attached to the rack, and some even have just a pedal without a pad. This pad has a mesh head, so it's a good idea to use the plastic side of the beater to prevent chafing. After attaching the pedal, we can roughly position the kick drum pad within the set, like we did with the other pads. There are a couple of metal spikes on the back to stop the pad from moving, but make sure not to extend them too far, or you could damage your floor even if you're using a rug. The same goes for the hi-hat. When it comes to mounting the module, there are as many ways to do it as there are manufacturers. On the MPS-850, the multi-pin connector for the pads is integrated into the module mount. Many kits have simpler solutions, but most manufacturers seem to agree that the module should be mounted on the same side as the hi-hat. In this case, all you need to do is tighten 3 screws, which is easy to do by hand. The plugs for the pads are usually labeled or at least numbered. For the hi-hat, we need to differentiate between the actual pad and the controller, in this case the opening sensor. Connecting the rest of the pads is pretty straightforward. On the MPS-850, the snare drum, tom 1, tom 2, tom 3, crash 1, ride cymbal, and the kick drum pad are connected via the multi-core cable. The additional pads for tom 4 and crash 2 are connected using separate cables. Many kits come with Velcro ties that help to avoid clutter. If you use them, make sure to leave some room for adjustments. Now that we've assembled and connected the drum set, let's make the necessary adjustments. Set up your drum seat so that your thighs are angled slightly downwards when you're sitting upright. In this case, our setup is obviously too low, and by that I mean not only the snare drum pad, but the entire set. So I'll slide the horizontal bars to which the pads are mounted upwards on the legs, and bring the hi-hat pad to about the same height as the upper toms. And you don't always have to follow the instructions to the T, as we can see on the snare. The mount isn't long enough to bring the pad up to a suitable height, so I'll flip the clamp around, and now I have enough leeway to bring the pad to where I need it. This allows me to position the snare so I can comfortably play both the head and the rim of the pad. After bringing all pads to the correct height, it's time for fine-tuning. All pads should be positioned in a way that allows you to play them at a shallow angle, which gives you the best rebound. Also make sure that the pads don't touch each other even when they're hit, as that could lead to unwanted triggers. And you shouldn't have to stretch to play the hi-hat and cymbal pads on the rim, as well as on the surface of the pad. Many players prefer a setup that's as compact as possible, with short distances between the pads. As most electronic drum pads are smaller than their acoustic counterparts, you have a lot of flexibility in your setup. But the pads also shouldn't be located too close to your body. In this case, I've decided to mount the cymbal booms at a slight angle. If you cannot reach the desired position using the included accessories, there's nothing stopping you from using standard cymbal stands. That's it. All that's left to do is connect the power supply, plug in your headphones, turn on the module, bring up the faders, turn up the volume, and start playing. Thank you for watching.